Hello there, dear listener. Welcome to this calm, cozy space where we delve into fascinating tales from history, perfect for unwinding at the end of a long day or drifting off to sleep. Before we begin our story, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and share. And if you enjoy these relaxing forays into the past, consider subscribing for more soothing, historical storytelling. Tonight, we embark on a journey back through the centuries to Imperial China, where we'll explore the complex and often difficult lives of the emperor's concubines. These women, chosen for their beauty and their potential to bear royal heirs, existed in a world that was both gilded and grim. As we peek behind the ornate screens and step into their embroidered slippers, we'll discover that life in the imperial harem was far from a fairy tale. But before we venture into the palace intrigue and personal dramas, let's first set the scene. Imagine the sprawling compounds of the Forbidden City in Beijing, with their vermilion walls, sweeping tiled roofs and grand halls. A place of unimaginable grandeur and wealth, the heart of a dynasty that ruled over millions. Zoom in closer and you'll find secluded courtyards and intimate chambers, where thousands of women spent their lives in service to one man, the Son of Heaven, the Emperor himself. Here, the usual order of Chinese society was upended. Within the high red walls, the Emperor's mother, Empress and consorts, wielded power and influence unthinkable for women in the outside world. Yet even the most favoured concubine could never forget that her status hung on the whims of men, her father or brothers who gave her to the palace, the emperor who decided her fate with a wave of his hand. She existed in a gilded cage, her life devoted to pleasing and bearing children for one all-powerful man. The story of how the institution of concubinage rose to such importance begins back in the mists of China's history. For dynasties, emperors took multiple consorts as a way to ensure a plentiful supply of male heirs to continue their lines. But concubines weren't just baby-making machines. They were also political pawns, signs of status and vessels for their families' hopes of advancement. From the mighty Tang to the final Qing dynasty, having a daughter selected as an imperial bedfellow was the highest ambition for many a Chinese family. Of course, the reality of concubine life rarely matched the fantasy. Behind the silks and jewels lay a world of cutthroat competition, precarious power, and dashed dreams. Many of these women, often just girls when they entered the palace, found that their great fortune came at a steep price. A life without freedom, security, or true companionship. As we'll see, an imperial concubine's only real path to influence was to win the emperor's favour and bear his son. But in the treacherous waters of harem politics, today's favourite could swiftly become tomorrow's cast-off. So come, let us pull back the embroidered curtain and tiptoe down the hushed palace corridors. There are secrets to uncover and stories to tell. Stories of vicious rivalries and doomed romance, of devastating loss and fleeting triumphs, of women who schemed and struggled to survive in a world they didn't choose. As we explore what it was really like to be one of the emperor's women, I invite you to sink deeper into relaxation, letting my voice and these tales from long ago carry you closer to tranquil slumber. Our first chapter begins with a young woman from a humble background who finds herself plucked from everything familiar and thrust into a whole new world. Imagine for a moment you are a teenage girl from a small village, accustomed to running in the fields with your siblings and learning embroidery at your mother's knee. But your delicate features and graceful bearing have caught the attention of an imperial scout, always on the lookout for potential new concubines to grace the emperor's halls and bear his offspring. One day, without warning, you are taken from your home and family to begin the long journey to the Forbidden City, You fight back tears as you bid farewell to everything you've ever known, your heart fluttering with both excitement and fear at what awaits you. You are headed for a place that looms large in myth and whispers, the Emperor's Palace, where thousands of women live out their lives in service to the Dragon Throne. As your palanquin carries you through the towering gates and into the palace grounds, you can't help but marvel at the grandeur that surrounds you, sweeping tiled roofs, gilded statues, and ornate pavilions. A whole world pulsing with life and activity. But as you are ushered into the secluded women's quarters, the reality of your new circumstances starts to set in. Here, you are no longer daughter, sister, or friend, but one of thousands of concubines vying for status and survival. You must quickly learn to navigate the intricate web of palace hierarchies and protocols. From how to dress and speak in the presence of superiors to the proper way to serve tea to the Empress Dowager, every action is regulated and scrutinized. The simplest mistake could mean humiliation or harsh punishment from higher-ranked consorts. Far from the warmth and freedoms of your old life, you find yourself in a regimented, almost monastic existence, your days dictated by the endless imperial rituals and duties. You are a bird in a gilded cage, your value tied to your beauty, fertility, and ability to please the Emperor. And yet, as you lie in your silk-draped bed at night, listening to the lonely sound of a flute drifting over the palace walls, you can't help but dream of the day when the Emperor might call you to his chambers and favor you with his affections. But as we shall see, winning the dragon's heart is a dangerous game, one that could lift you to dizzying heights or cast you into ruin. The life of an imperial concubine was often nasty, brutish and short, with true power and security always just out of reach. As we continue our tale, we'll meet concubines who schemed and struggled, who rose and fell, all in the hopes of surviving in this glittering but treacherous world. For now, though, let us leave our young heroine to find her way in this strange new land of rules and rituals, to take her place on the lowest rungs of the harem hierarchy. Her story is just beginning, and there are many more to be told. As we pause here, I invite you to let go of any remaining tensions, to sink a little deeper into relaxation as my soothing voice carries you closer to restful sleep. There's no need to hold on to the details or remember every name. Simply let the tale wash over you like a gently flowing river. In our next chapter, we'll explore the vicious harem politics that ensnared so many concubines, where a careless word or a strategically placed gift could make or break a woman's fate. We'll see how even the most innocent young concubine could be drawn into the deadly games of seduction and betrayal that roiled beneath the palace's placid surface. But that is a story for another time. For now, dear listener, I invite you to simply rest, to let my words paint pictures in your mind as you drift closer to sleep's sweet embrace. The tale will be here waiting for you next time, ready to carry you back to that long-ago world of silk and shadows, of whispered secrets and forgotten dreams. Until then, may your slumber be deep and peaceful, and your dreams filled with the gentle currents of history's stream. Good night. The first thing a young girl selected to join the imperial harem would have noticed was how different the Forbidden City looked, smelled and sounded from anywhere she'd been before. As she stepped through towering red gates into the vast walled complex, an alien world of soaring tile roofs, grand ceremonial halls, and exquisitely landscaped gardens unfolded before her eyes. Incense hung thick and heady on the air, mingling with the scent of fragrant woods and the perfumes of thousands of scrupulously groomed women. The clamour of the city outside faded, replaced by chirping birds, murmuring eunuchs, and the swish of the long embroidered silk robes favoured by the palace residents. For a girl from a humble background, as many of the emperor's chosen women were, the magnificence and size of the Forbidden City would have been jaw-dropping. It's estimated that during the Ming dynasty, The palace complex housed as many as 10,000 eunuchs and maids, in addition to the emperor's hundreds of wives and consorts, all dedicated to serving the Son of Heaven and his sprawling imperial household. Just the harem quarters alone, known as the Six Palaces, contained hundreds of buildings and some 9,000 rooms. But for a new concubine, wonder at her opulent surroundings would soon give way to apprehension and anxiety. Here she would live out the rest of her days, sequestered from the outside world, her sole purpose to serve the emperor and bear his children. From the day she set foot in the Forbidden City, her old life and identity would be left behind, subsumed into the highly regimented, minutely hierarchical society of the imperial harem. The first order of business for a teenage concubine-to-be was learning the countless rules and protocols that governed every aspect of palace life. Each rank of consort had its own strictly prescribed conduct, privileges, and living arrangements. A dizzying array of minute regulations dictated everything from how to walk, speak, and bow in the presence of a superior to permissible colors of clothing and styles of jewelry and headpieces. Even for a low-ranking concubine, mastering this meticulous palace etiquette was essential, as a single slip-up could mean a severe beating or even expulsion from the harem. Eunuchs and older palace women would drill the girl daily in the proper forms of address, comportment, and ritual until she could navigate the myriad codes of harem society. Along with learning her new role, a novice concubine would have to adjust to being utterly cut off from her family and former way of life. Contact with men outside the palace was forbidden, and an elaborate system of isolating the emperor's women evolved over the dynasties. By the Qing era, the harem was practically its own walled city within the Forbidden City. Concubines lived in seclusion in the Six Palaces, their comings and goings monitored by armies of watchful eunuchs. Venturing out of the harem quarters into other areas of the Forbidden City required layers of advance approval and planning. Wherever the emperor's women went, eunuchs came ahead to clear the streets of all men, hanging curtains over doorways and windows. The only glimpse of the world outside the towering red walls came once a year, when chosen concubines accompanied the emperor to make sacrifices at the Temple of Heaven. Even then, they travelled in curtained palanquins, hidden from view. So a concubine had to reconcile herself to living in a gilded cage for the rest of her life, her chances of ever leaving remote. Few emperors allowed their consorts to retire from the palace, even in old age. An emperor's women were considered his possessions, not free to leave his service. In the words of one Qing emperor, they belonged to the palace and should die in the palace. For a vivid illustration of how difficult this severing of family ties could be for a young woman, consider the story of Imperial concubine Li, who entered the Forbidden City at the age of 13 in the early 1800s. Chosen for her beauty, Li was the daughter of a Han Chinese general, but her family's military status didn't exempt her from the loneliness and fear experienced by new palace women from all backgrounds. In the 1827 memoir Yehonala's Captivity, Li recalled her traumatic early days as a junior concubine. She referred to the Forbidden City as a large prison and wrote of her despair at losing all contact with her parents and siblings. Li's brother, a powerful general, petitioned the emperor to allow his sister a brief visit home to see her dying father, but the request was denied. "I felt as if I was living a nightmare." Li wrote of realizing she might never see her family again. As much as a concubine might miss the comforts and freedoms of her former life, she had no choice but to dedicate herself to her new role. First and foremost, serving the emperor. While emperors had their pick of hundreds of beautiful women, most of his chosen concubines would never so much as speak to him or be summoned to his bed. But from her first day in the palace, a concubine had to be ready to wait on and submit to the emperor at any time. Eunuchs and maidservants would help the women dress to be pleasing to the emperor in case he called them to attend on him. They wore elaborate makeup and were doused in his favorite scents. At night, the concubines slept in bedding printed with names so the emperor could easily choose one of them to spend the night with him. For the small minority of concubines who drew the emperor's favor, pleasing him became a consuming pursuit, the key to survival and advancement in the cutthroat world of harem politics. An emperor's sexual and emotional preferences could become an obsessive focus. His preferred wine, music, poetry, even pillow arrangement were carefully studied. With success so dependent on fickle male desire, a coveted position was never secure. While low-ranking concubines scraped by on meager allowances and wore rough cotton and linen, the most favored consorts dripped in pearls and jade and enjoyed lives of great material privilege. If a concubine was lucky enough to bear the emperor a son, she could be elevated to the status of consort or even empress and wield significant influence at court. So the stakes were high in the contest for imperial favor and the benefits it brought. But it was a treacherous game to play, as a consort who fell from grace could face demotion, exile, or worse. The potential rewards tempted some ambitious concubines to resort to vicious schemes against their rivals, from character assassinations to actual murder by poison. Few concubines in history deployed seduction and manipulation with as much ruthless skill as consort Qi, who entered the Ming Emperor Jia Jing's harem as a junior concubine sometime in the 1530s. A woman of humble birth but exceptional beauty and cunning, Qi quickly became Jia Jing's favorite. Not content with her exalted status, she set out to destroy the woman who outranked her, Empress Chen, Jia Jing's first wife. The plotting concubine bribed a eunuch to accuse Empress Chen of using witchcraft to curse the emperor, a treasonous offense. At consort Qi's urging, Jia Jing ordered his wife arrested and the use of torture to extract a confession from her. The empress was demoted to a commoner and imprisoned, but even in disgrace she remained a threat to Qi's ambitions. In a shocking power grab, Qi allegedly had the deposed empress strangled to death with a silken cord. With her rival eliminated, Qi persuaded Jia Jing to make her the new empress, despite a long-standing taboo against emperors marrying a consort. For the rest of Jia Jing's reign, Empress Qi was the real power behind the throne, sparking resentment at court with her self-serving schemes and lavish spending on palaces and jewels. Qi's ruthless triumph was an extreme case, but one that showcased how far a concubine might go in the no-holds-barred struggle for status and survival that was a defining feature of harem life. In the Darwinian world of the imperial palace, a woman had to compete for every scrap of influence and security for herself and her children, and no matter how high she climbed, her position was never truly safe. One misstep or a shift in court politics could spell a concubine's downfall, even from the pinnacles of favor. Dozens of empress dowagers, consorts, and concubines throughout history met chilling ends at the hands of their emperors, eunuchs, the royal court, or bureaucrats. The cautionary tale of consort Qi, who schemed her way from obscurity to the role of empress, only underscores the precarity of a palace woman's life. In the end, not even she was untouchable. After Emperor Jiajing's death, his successor demoted Qi and had her imprisoned, forcing her to hand over vast sums in gold, silver, and jewelry. Though she wasn't killed, the conniving concubine who had wielded such power spent her final days in lonely disgrace, a disgraced relic of the previous reign. If even an empress could be brought so low, imagine the vulnerability of the thousands of nameless low-born women who passed through the imperial harem over the centuries. With little formal education and no powerful family connections to protect them, they were utterly dependent on the whims of the emperor and palace power players. And when their looks faded or they failed to bear children, they became disposable. So beyond the backstabbing rivalries, crushing boredom and lack of freedom, concubines faced the knowledge that they could be cast aside at any time. even after years of service. With no practical skills or resources, a woman expelled from the palace in disgrace might be reduced to begging or prostitution to survive. Luo Qilan's story illustrates the precarious fates of concubines who found themselves on the wrong side of an emperor's favor. A minor consort to the Ming Tianqi emperor in the early 1600s, Luo bore 2 daughters, failing to give the emperor the son he desired. She soon fell out of Tianqi's good graces as younger, more beautiful concubines caught his eye. In his frustration at not having a male heir, Tianqi demoted Luo to a maid and expelled her from the palace to become a Taoist nun. Leaving behind her young daughters, a humiliated Luo traveled to Mount Mao, her palace finery traded for a nun's humble robes, her hair shorn off as a sign of religious devotion. But even in exile, the concubine turned nun wasn't safe. The Tianqi emperor, gripped by paranoia, came to believe that Luo was plotting against him. In 1625, he had the middle-aged woman dragged back to Beijing and thrown in prison on charges of treason. There she was tortured alongside other members of Tianqi's harem who had lost favor. Luo Qilan ultimately died in prison before the charges against her could be substantiated. It's believed that the psychological trauma of her interrogation and torture, combined with the dank conditions of the imperial prison, permanently broke her health. The tragic end of the emperor's former concubine, persecuted even after leaving palace life behind, underscores how expendable these women were, subject to the cruel turns of imperial caprice. For the few concubines who did manage to stay in their emperor's good graces, the rewards could be substantial. Lavish living quarters, fine clothing and food, and a chance at the ultimate prize, bearing the emperor a son and heir. In the relentlessly male-dominated society of Imperial China, a concubine's status and future hinged on producing children, especially boys who could carry on the royal line. But becoming pregnant with the emperor's child was an unpredictable lottery, and the pressure on young concubines was intense. Even if a woman was frequently summoned to the emperor's bed, conception was far from guaranteed in an era before modern fertility treatments. And for concubines who did get pregnant, the dangers of childbirth in a time of limited medical knowledge loomed. Imperial records are full of terse accounts of childbed calamities in the harem. Difficult labours that lasted for days, killing mother and child. Hemorrhages and infections that claimed lives. Newborns too weak or sickly to survive. Even if a concubine safely delivered a healthy baby, she was still at risk for further pregnancies and births. Doctors of the day had little understanding of postnatal care or women's health needs. These reproductive perils are poignantly embodied in the short life of consort Duan, a low-ranking concubine chosen for the harem of the Ming Yongle emperor in the early 1400s. A girl of humble origins from rural Zhejiang province, Duan was barely 15 when she entered the Forbidden City. It's unknown whether she was literate or educated, as many minor consorts weren't. But Duan had a quality highly prized in imperial consorts: fecundity. Within a year of her arrival in the palace, the young concubine found herself pregnant with Yongle's child. It was a chance for her to rise in the harem hierarchy, but Duan's body couldn't withstand the rigors of childbearing. 6 months into her term, she went into premature labor and delivered a tiny infant girl who died within hours. The traumatic birth experience left Duan with severe complications, including an infection that would have been easily treatable today, but was potentially deadly in the 15th century. As she lay feverish and bleeding in the weeks after the birth, the emperor's doctors were at a loss for how to help her. Herbal poultices, acupuncture and prayers to Buddha failed to stop Duan's decline. Just shy of her 17th birthday, the unfortunate concubine succumbed to sepsis, another casualty of the harem's demand for heirs. Duan's story was sadly typical of the era, a time when imperial concubines had an average life expectancy of just 25 years. A woman who survived multiple pregnancies and births was considered fortunate. Sons, of course, were the goal, but in a time before ultrasounds, the sex of a baby remained a mystery until delivery. Concubines could do little more than hope and pray for boys. For rare consorts like Xiao Zhuang, a 17th century concubine of the Qing Tianqi emperor, the dangerous lottery of imperial childbearing paid off spectacularly. The daughter of a general, Xiao Zhuang came to Tianqi's attention for her beauty and lively personality. But it was her proven fertility that earned her a coveted place in his bed. Within a year of entering the harem, Xiao Zhuang bore Tianqi a daughter who died in infancy. Undeterred, she quickly conceived again and in 1592 delivered a healthy son. In jubilant celebration of finally getting a male heir, Tianqi promoted Xiao Zhuang to the status of consort, granting her a generous living allowance and household staff. When Tianqi died unexpectedly just a year later, Xiao Zhuang's 2-year-old son was named the new Chongzhen Emperor. And as mother of the boy king, Xiao Zhuang found herself in the powerful role of Empress, Dowager, and Regent. At the age of 21, she was the most important woman in China, all because she had produced a single male child who happened to be born at the right time. Of course, for every fairy tale rise like Xiao Zhuang's, there were thousands of nameless concubines whose failure to birth sons consigned them to the lowest, most vulnerable rungs of the harem hierarchy. With little hope of ever gaining the emperor's favor or protection, they were often subjected to cruel abuses and humiliations at the hands of higher-ranking consorts and palace staff. So even motherhood, the one avenue for a concubine to improve her lot, came with its own set of risks and heartbreaks. To gain status and security, a woman first had to survive the dangers of repeated childbirth and produce the right kind of child, a healthy son. For every concubine like Xiao Zhuang, who achieved power through her male offspring, untold numbers of others perished in the attempt or spent their lives languishing in obscurity. Looking at these women's stories from a modern vantage point, it can be hard to fathom the intense pressures and restrictions they lived under, valued only for their youth, beauty, and ability to reproduce. But even as we recoil at the idea of a woman's destiny being so dependent on serving and pleasing men, there are glimmers of defiance, ingenuity, and self-determination in some palace women's lives. As stifling and perilous as the life of a concubine could be, a few rare individuals found ways to carve out spheres of influence. Some, like the scheming consort Qi, deployed cunning and guile to turn the system to their advantage, even bringing down an empress. Others used what little leisure time they had to pursue art, music, and literature, leaving behind a legacy of cultural contributions. Even in the rigid, patriarchal world of the Forbidden City, spaces existed where strong-willed palace women could exercise a degree of agency and self-expression within the constraints of their circumstances. Understanding their struggles and triumphs adds nuance and humanity to our conception of the imperial harem. So as we delve into the darker aspects of life as a palace concubine, it's important to remember that these women weren't just passive victims, but individuals navigating an oppressive system with resilience, resourcefulness, and occasional flashes of rebellion. Those who, the poignant later years of Imperial concubine Li, serve as a sobering reminder of the precariousness of an imperial consort's position. Born into a scholarly family and known for her quick wit and literary talent, the young Li caught the emperor's eye and was brought into the palace as a junior concubine. She quickly rose through the ranks as her sharp intellect and fresh perspective captivated the emperor. Palace observers began to speculate that she might even displace the empress herself. But the wheel of fortune is ever turning in the imperial harem, and favor is fickle. Over time, the emperor's interest began to wane. Concubine Li's bookish, unconventional nature, once so alluring, started to chafe. She rejected the stifling rules and rituals of palace life, preferring to spend her time reading and writing poetry. Worse still, she had failed in what was widely seen as a concubine's most important duty: bearing sons. After 3 daughters and multiple miscarriages, it was whispered that she was cursed, unable to give the emperor the male heir he so desperately desired. As a new generation of beautiful young concubines arrived at court, full of fresh charms and pliant obedience, Li fell further out of favor. The emperor stopped visiting her quarters altogether. The servants began to ignore her requests and snub her in the halls. Ambitious rivals spread rumors of Li's odd behavior and aloof, arrogant attitude. One winter morning, she was abruptly ordered to leave the palace, without even a chance to bid farewell to her daughters. Officially, she had been granted the great honor of retiring from palace service to preserve her health. But the humiliating truth was known to all. Li had been cast aside, no longer wanted. Alone in her family's country estate, Li spent her days immersed in her books and her writing, her one true solace. But even then, the stigma of a discarded concubine clung to her. Whispers followed her in the village. Her own family was distant, as if her failure at court had tainted them too. Li's final years were spent in solitude, with only her poems for company, until she faded into obscurity. To history, she became just one more name in the long list of imperial concubines, her story lost among countless others. We can only imagine the pain and loneliness of her final years, banished far from the world she had known for so long. Her fate reflects the cold, harsh reality for so many women of the imperial harem. One moment, a cherished companion of the most powerful man in China. The next, a disgraced exile, abandoned and alone. As we ponder the story of concubine Li and so many of her fellow consorts, it's hard not to reflect on the existential uncertainties that plagued their lives. From the moment a concubine entered the palace, her fate was no longer her own. She became a pawn in a game of politics, power, and dynastic ambitions that stretched far beyond the harem walls. In times of instability and turmoil, a concubine's life could be upended at a moment's notice, subject to the whims of warring factions or the vengeance of a new regime. The bloody transition between dynasties or an emperor's death could spell doom for those left behind, as the new power holders sought to erase all traces of the old order. One of the most dramatic examples of this precarity came during the tumultuous final years of the Ming dynasty in the 17th century. As rebel forces stormed the capital and the last Ming emperor hanged himself from a tree, the once mighty imperial harem dissolved into chaos. The rebel leader, Li Zichang, upon capturing the Forbidden City, was said to have rounded up all the emperor's concubines for his troops' pleasure, before ordering them slaughtered. The luckier ones were able to take their own lives first. Others were not so fortunate. The teenage consort, Tian, a cherished companion of the emperor known for her ethereal beauty, was dragged from the palace by the jubilant rebels, defiled and put to the sword. As one dynasty fell and another rose to take its place, countless palace women found themselves caught in the crossfire, their lives snuffed out in an instant. In the grand machinations of empire building and war, a concubine was ultimately insignificant, easily discarded and forgotten by history. The concubines who did survive regime changes or an emperor's death often faced lonely, purposeless futures. Unless they had sons in line for the throne, an emperor's passing usually meant exile from the palace and a drastic loss of status. Some would retire to Buddhist monasteries or return to their families in significantly reduced circumstances. Others lived out their days in isolated palace apartments, clinging to the fading memories of a glorious past. Consort Qi, a low-ranking concubine of the Qianlong emperor, renowned for her gentle nature and domestic skills, spent nearly 6 decades in the palace, most of them alone, after the emperor's death. She busied herself with needlework and cat rearing, finding quiet purpose in a life of solitude until dying at the remarkable age of 96. For all the romantic tales of great imperial love stories and concubines who rose to wield extraordinary influence, the reality is that the vast majority of these women led cloistered, unfulfilled lives, with little autonomy or control over their destinies. They were ornaments, vessels for childbearing, instruments of pleasure, but rarely were they truly seen or treasured for themselves. In the end, when we look past the silk and jewels and decadent trappings of the imperial harem, we find real women with hopes and dreams and fears, most of whom suffered more than they celebrated. The palace walls confined them as much as sheltering them, cutting them off from the simple joys of freedom, family, and true human connection. One can only imagine the profound loneliness and quiet despair that so often lurked beneath the elaborate makeup and dazzling finery. As we conclude our journey through the inner world of the imperial concubines, let us remember the individual human stories behind the grand tales of history. These women were daughters, sisters, mothers, each with her own unique voice and experiences, even if most have been lost to time. In recognizing the immense challenges and inequities they faced, we honor their resilience, their sacrifices, and their fleeting moments of triumph in a system stacked against them. The life of a concubine in Imperial China was, for most, a gilded cage, a place of illusory luxury and prestige that could turn into a suffocating prison at a moment's notice. They existed suspended between worlds, never fully belonging to the imperial household, but cut off from normal society and any chance at an ordinary life. In many ways, the harem was a microcosm of the rigid hierarchies and power imbalances that shaped much of traditional Chinese society. It was a realm where a woman's worth was determined by her youth, her beauty, and above all, her ability to bear sons, a place that pitted woman against woman in a relentless competition for survival and status. For all the romantic fantasies and exotic mystique that have long surrounded the institution of the imperial harem, the reality was often one of exploitation, frustration, and despair. The stories of these concubines, told in whispers and snippets and tantalizing fragments, remind us of the immense complexity of the human experience across time, of the ways in which even the most exalted and envied of existences could be shot through with profound tragedy and loss. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson we can take from the lives of the imperial concubines is a renewed appreciation for the extraordinary freedoms and opportunities so many of us enjoy today. The idea of a world in which half the population could be effectively imprisoned and reduced to commodities in service of the other is shocking to the modern sensibility. Yet this was the accepted reality for countless generations of Chinese women. As we close this chapter on the inner realm of the emperor's consorts, let us carry forward a spirit of empathy and a determination to continue fighting for a world in which every individual, regardless of gender or circumstance, has the chance to live a life of purpose, dignity, and self-determination. The poignant shadows of the women who dwelled deep within the Forbidden City remind us of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Though their voices have faded, their stories endure as a testament to the indomitable human spirit in the face of even the most suffocating constraints. In honoring their memory, we keep alive the dream of a world in which the yearning hearts of the forsaken concubines might finally find solace, and every woman might have the chance to shape her own destiny under the boundless open sky. The difficult road to motherhood. For the women of the imperial harem, the pressure to produce an heir, especially a son, was immense. A concubine's entire future and status depended on her fertility and success in bearing the emperor's child. But becoming pregnant with a royal baby was far from guaranteed. With thousands of beautiful women vying for the emperor's attention, most concubines only rarely had the opportunity to spend the night with their sovereign master. Some were summoned to the emperor's bed only once in their lives. Even for the fortunate few who did catch the emperor's eye, the occasions for intimate encounters were limited, dictated by elaborate palace rituals and rotation systems designed to give many women a chance to serve the Son of Heaven. But even if a concubine did manage to conceive, her trials were only beginning. Pregnancy and childbirth were incredibly perilous in an era of primitive obstetrics and limited medical knowledge. Without modern healthcare, a shocking number of mothers and babies didn't survive the ordeal of delivery. Palace records are filled with tragic accounts of imperial women who suffered miscarriages or died in childbirth. Even if a concubine safely delivered a child, she held her breath until the sex was announced. Because bearing a daughter instead of a longed-for son could be a grave disappointment that diminished rather than elevated her standing. The story of Consort Li, a young concubine during the reign of the Jiajing Emperor in the Ming dynasty, poignantly illustrates the crushing pressures and cruel lottery of imperial motherhood. A graceful dancer from a declining noble family, the teenage Li caught the emperor's eye and was brought into the palace as a mid-ranking consort. To her surprise and delight, the emperor began frequently seeking out her company, captivated by her beauty and charm. Within a year, she was pregnant with the emperor's child. Overjoyed, she became the envy of the harem, lauded by palace officials and lavished with gifts and ceremonies. However, Consort Li's fairy tale rise was shattered when, 7 months into her pregnancy, she went into early labor. After an agonizing delivery, she gave birth to a stillborn son. Devastated, she fell out of favor with the emperor, who shunned her as a bringer of ill fortune. A few months later, ignoring medical advice to let her body heal, the desperate consort rushed to get pregnant again, terrified of being cast aside. Her rashness backfired tragically when she miscarried an unviable pregnancy, leaving her bedridden for months with a terrible infection. Abandoned by the emperor and shunned by the other concubines, Consort Li became a social pariah in the palace, treated as an outcast and failure. It wasn't until 3 long years later, after a regime of herbal fertility treatments from the palace physicians, that Consort Li was finally able to conceive again and carry a baby to term. But by a cruel twist of fate this time, she delivered a healthy baby girl. While the emperor acknowledged the child as his daughter, he was clearly disappointed and began transferring his attentions to other, more promising concubines. Li would have only one more pregnancy, another daughter, that finally made the emperor give up on her as the bearer of his heir. Sadly, Consort Li never gave the Jiajing emperor the son he sought, and her star at court gradually waned. But against all odds, she did manage to survive over 30 years in the cutthroat environment of the imperial harem and escape the usual fates of disfavored concubines: expulsion, exile, or even death. She eventually earned the role of managing the imperial silk workshops, finding some measure of purpose and protection for her daughters, even if she never achieved the glory and status she once dreamed of. The quiet dignity and resilience with which Consort Li endured her many disappointments and losses was perhaps the greatest legacy this remarkable woman passed down to her daughters and to history: the precarious position of imperial favor. Even for the select few concubines who successfully bore the emperor's children and basked in the glow of his affections, their lofty position was always a fragile, slippery perch. In a system where imperial favor was the sole currency of status, even the slightest frown from the Son of Heaven could spell a concubine's downfall. The same intimate access to the emperor that was a concubine's greatest source of power was also her greatest vulnerability. Emperors were mercurial, easily distracted by the next new beauty, and could be turned against a once beloved mistress by the slightest rumor of scandal or a well-planted slander by a rival. The story of imperial noble consort Chunhui, a concubine of the Qianlong emperor of the Qing dynasty, is a sobering example of the fleeting, fickle nature of imperial favor. Born into a noble Manchu family, the young Chun Hui was selected as a potential bride for the emperor at the age of 13. Fortunately for her, the emperor was immediately taken with her refined beauty and intelligence. After entering the palace, her quick wit, musical talent and gift for composing amused and impressed the emperor, who spent hours conversing with her. She rose swiftly through the ranks until she was named Imperial Noble Consort, the second highest position in the harem, subordinate only to the empress herself. Her family was elevated with her father and brothers receiving high court appointments. For over a decade, Consort Chun Hui was the undisputed favorite of the emperor, who called her his heart's companion. She bore him 3 daughters and lived a life of prestige, luxury, and influence that was the envy of the palace. The emperor frequently took her on imperial hunts and tours, valuing her counsel and entrusting her to draft edicts and correspondence on his behalf. Some court observers even whispered that the consort's power and favor now rivaled that of the empress. But Chun Hui's privileged position and the resentment it stirred would prove to be her undoing. As she approached her 30s, she found it increasingly difficult to maintain the youthful allure and docile temperament that the emperor preferred in his bedroom companions. Meanwhile, a new bevy of teenage concubines was entering the palace, eager to seduce the emperor and usurp Chun Hui's position. The aging consort's enemies saw their opening to strike. Rumors began swirling that Chun Hui had grown temperamental and shrewish, displeasing the emperor with her nagging and presumption. Whispers of her family's abuse of imperial favor to enrich themselves and subvert the Manchu aristocracy spread like poison. The final nail in Consort Chun Hui's coffin came when she was accused by a palace maid of practicing black magic to curse the empress and the emperor's young new favorite, Consort Ling. Enraged by the allegations and increasingly distant from Chun Hui, the Qianlong emperor ordered his once beloved consort arrested and interrogated under torture. While she refused to confess to the charges, the damage had already been done. Stripped of her position and titles, the disgraced Chun Hui was expelled from court and imprisoned in a remote frontier fortress on the frigid edge of the empire. Tragically, she died a few years later in lonely exile, a bleak end to a glittering life. Her family was also implicated and purged, erasing the legacy she had worked so hard to build. The sad fate of Consort Chun Hui stands as a warning about the fleeting, backstabbing intrigues of imperial politics, where even the most favored concubine could be cast out in the cold at the smallest shift in the winds of power. Powerless pawns in the game of dynasties. The harem was never a tranquil sanctuary, separated from the tumultuous realpolitik of Imperial China. Rather, it was a key battleground where palace power struggles, dynastic conflicts, and even international diplomacy played out on the most intimate stage. Concubines could, at any moment, find themselves transformed into political chess pieces, married off to seal an alliance, taken hostage by an invading army, or even massacred in a purge, if their ties to the losing faction of a succession struggle made them a liability. And the most dangerous, tenuous position of all was that of the concubines in service to the conquered dynasty when a new line of rulers seized the dragon throne. The turbulent transition from the Ming to the Qing dynasty in the 17th century and the tragic fate of the southern Ming imperial concubines left behind in the Forbidden City starkly illustrates the perils of being a powerless pawn trapped amidst the tides of history. When the Ming capital of Beijing fell to the invading Manchu armies, the last Ming emperor hanged himself on Coal Hill, overlooking the palace, ending his dynasty's 276-year reign. Amidst the chaos and bloodshed of the Manchu takeover, most of the Ming imperial family either fled or were captured and executed. But in the harem apartments of the Forbidden City, the several hundred concubines of the vanquished Ming emperor found themselves abandoned and sealed in with no means of escape. At first, the Manchu general in charge of securing the palace assured the terrified women that they would not be harmed. Many of the higher-ranking consorts and the Ming Empress Dowager initially refused to even unlock the doors to their apartments, let alone come out and surrender to the foreign invaders. But after a tense standoff, the Manchus began to forcibly break into the harem quarters. What happened over the following days would live on in infamy in the palace records and popular legends as one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Forbidden City. The conquering Manchu forces, fueled by adrenaline and flush with victory, saw the former Ming imperial concubines as the spoils of war. The youngest and most attractive women were taken as war prizes. Some hauled away to be gifted to the Khan as tribute. Others handed out to the Manchu officers as rewards for their service. Those that resisted risked mutilation or even death. The older and less desirable consorts were simply left to fend for themselves or driven out to starve in the streets as beggars. A fortunate few found protection by quickly marrying into the invading army. But for many, suicide by hanging or drowning was seen as the only escape from dishonor and an uncertain future at the mercy of their conquerors. The new Qing emperor tried to restore a semblance of dignity to the palace by incorporating some of the remaining Ming consorts into his own harem in subordinate roles and ranks, where they could keep an eye on them. But even those spared the worst fates would never truly be trusted. For the rest of their lives, the surviving Ming concubines lived under a cloud of suspicion and resentment, always at risk of being implicated in the constant Ming loyalist rebellions and plots against Qing rule. The anguish, abuse, and fear they endured would haunt the harem for generations, a bloody reminder of the steep price of dynastic change paid by even the most cloistered women of the palace. Lonely, unfulfilled lives. For all the scheming and jockeying for status that defined harem life, the reality was that the vast majority of imperial concubines spent their lives waiting for a brief moment of affection or recognition that would never come. The mathematically impossible odds that a concubine, even a high-ranking one, would capture the emperor's sustained attention meant that most passed their days in an excruciatingly limited world, cut off from the normal joys and sorrows of life. With so many women and so few opportunities to leave a mark, thousands of talented, vivacious, and remarkable concubines lived and died in total obscurity within the red walls, leaving no trace of their names or stories in the records of history. This quiet tragedy is perhaps best exemplified by the life of concubine Qi, a minor consort during the reign of the Tongzhi emperor in the late Qing dynasty. The daughter of a famed scholar, she was a precociously intelligent and accomplished poet who was selected for the harem at age 15 for her literary talent. Her erudition and ethereal beauty reportedly enchanted the teenage emperor when she was presented to him, inspiring him to write several poems celebrating her as his exquisite orchid and jade treasure. Qi and her family rejoiced at this promising start, certain that she was destined for great things. But the young emperor proved to be more infatuated with the idea of Qi as his muse than with the flesh and blood woman. After a few months of chaste romance conducted mainly through the exchange of florid poems, his attentions shifted to the more accommodating beauties who shared his bed. Qi was given a comfortable but lowly rank, her quarters furbished tastefully but without extravagance, with little realistic hope of ever seeing the emperor in person again. She found herself marooned in a strange limbo, cut off from her family, but denied any official status or duties in the rigid imperial household. At first, Qi passed the time by penning wistful poems about her cloistered longing and the changing of the seasons in the imperial gardens that were her entire world. She made a few friends among the other minor consorts who shared her love of literature and comforted herself with the dream that she might still one day be summoned to perform for the emperor and win his favor. But as the years crept by and the emperor remained distant, concubine Qi's hopes gradually dimmed. She came to realize that her lonely life in the palace was not a temporary way station, but a permanent destination. As Qi grew older, she sought solace in the small pleasures and duties available to a woman of her rank, caring for her songbirds, practicing her calligraphy, and mentoring the occasional young consort who arrived at court as naive and optimistic as she had once been. She watched from the sidelines as the emperor took a succession of higher-ranked wives who gave him a daughter but no son before his untimely death from smallpox at the age of 18. In the aftermath, Qi found herself stranded in the palace as forgotten backwater, an aging relic of a previous reign that few in the new court even remembered. In the end, concubine Qi would spend 48 years living in the Forbidden City, nearly her entire life, but would only ever see the emperor that one time at her presentation. She died peacefully in her bed at the age of 63, having outlived the Tongji emperor by almost half a century. In accordance with custom, she was buried in a small side pavilion of the imperial tombs, her coffin and tablet bearing only her title and rank, with no mention of her name or accomplishments. The small collection of exquisite but melancholy poems she left behind were preserved by her family, but were later lost amidst the tumult of the 20th century. Today, all we know of the life of this sad, sensitive soul are a scant few lines in the palace service records, documenting a promising bud that withered on the vine in the airless atmosphere of the harem, a stand-in for the untold multitudes whose laments were buried with them. Conclusion: the lives of imperial concubines, whether the influential few or the eclipsed many, were always prescribed by forces far beyond their control. Constricted by a rigid hierarchy, straitjacketed by implacable rules and conventions, and ultimately condemned to live and die at the pleasure of one all-powerful man, even the most successful concubines faced a precarious and prescribed existence, faced with the unenviable choice between ruthless self-advancement or resigned self-abnegation. Each concubine had to find her own way to navigate the strange half-world of the harem. For the handful of concubines who ascended to the apex of that gilded cage and made their mark on history, even the dizziest heights of privilege and transient power were laced with peril and hard won through traumatic trials. For the countless others who lived and died anonymously between the vermilion walls, their identities subsumed into a dehumanizing system, it is impossible to fathom the depths of loneliness, frustration, and quiet desperation that defined their days. The forces that compelled a young girl, scarcely more than a child, to submit to being locked away in a stifling palace for the rest of her life, to serve as a living symbol of male imperial power at the cost of all autonomy, all privacy, and all other human bonds, remain in many ways incomprehensible to the modern mind. Even the luckiest concubines who earned the admiration of the emperor and the opportunity to shape palace politics paid for their exalted status with a public perch that left them exposed to the cruel crosswinds of court conspiracies and dynastic intrigues. And for the vast majority who lived out their lives in gilded insignificance, history can only imagine the poignant dreams left unfulfilled behind their latticed windows. But however restricted and tragic the individual lives of most imperial concubines were, in the aggregate they helped shape Chinese history over millennia. The women of the harem were the intimate partners, sounding boards and emotional compasses to the men that ruled over and steered the course of the Middle Kingdom. The mothers of heirs, the power behind the throne, the vessels of dynastic legitimacy, concubines wielded a clandestine, indirect authority passed down from generation to generation through whispers behind the silk screen. It is telling that some of the most famous women in Chinese history, from Empress Lu Ji to Dowager Cixi, rose to the pinnacle of power from the ranks of the harem. So when we look back at the lives of imperial concubines through the mists of time, we must see them not just as victims or seductresses, but as survivors and storytellers. Through their struggles, triumphs, and tragedies, they have left us a uniquely feminine chronicle of life in the palace, an alternate history that runs like a hidden thread through the grand tapestry of Imperial. The most famous concubine in Chinese history, who rose from obscure origins to become the emperor's favorite and alter the course of a dynasty, was Yang Guifei of the Tang dynasty. Born into a humble family, her beauty caught the eye of Emperor Xuanzong's favorite consort, and Yang Yuhuan, as she was then called, was recruited into the palace as a low-ranking concubine. There, her stunning looks, musical talent, and quick wit soon won her the attention and affection of the emperor himself. Yang Guifei's rise was meteoric. Xuanzong was so besotted with her that he neglected matters of state to spend all his time with her, showering her with extravagant gifts and titles. He even had the imperial chefs invent new dishes to tempt her appetite. The emperor built her lavish palaces and gardens, the most famous being the Huaqing Palace, with its steaming thermal pools where the lovers would bathe. So great was his adoration that Yang Guifei was allowed to ride in the imperial chariot with Xuanzong and dine at the imperial table, unheard of privileges for a concubine. But this great love story was also a cautionary tale about the dangers of an emperor losing himself in passion and neglecting his duties. As he entrusted ever more power to corrupt officials and Yang Guifei's wastrel kinsmen, the empire began to teeter. When a disastrous rebellion broke out, Xuanzong was forced to flee the capital along with his beloved consort. In a tragic turn, his guards blamed Yang Guifei for the chaos and demanded her death. Heartbroken, the emperor was forced to consent, and Yang Guifei was strangled to death in front of him. It's said that after she perished, the emperor held her lifeless body in his arms and wept inconsolably. The romantic but doomed love between Xuanzong and Yang Guifei has been immortalized in Chinese poetry, plays, and artwork in the centuries since. The great poet Bai Juyi wrote a famous long poem, Song of Everlasting Sorrow, recounting their sweeping tale. To this day, Yang Guifei is still revered as one of the four beauties of ancient China. But her story also crystallized for many the perils of an emperor losing his way in the pleasures of the harem. Indeed, the institution of concubinage was often criticized by scholars and officials as an unnecessary distraction at best, and at worst, a destructive influence that could drag down an entire dynasty, as the Tang nearly experienced. Throughout Chinese history, the harem was a constant source of intrigue, excess, and instability that had to be tightly controlled. This was a key reason behind the practice of selecting brides. The periodic recruitment drives to find new young women to replenish the imperial harem. Emperors and their advisors were always on the lookout for girls from good families, with beauty, intelligence, and virtue, who could be molded into proper palace ladies and bear suitable heirs. The choosings were conducted with great fanfare as the emperor's representatives scoured the land for candidates. For a commoner family, having a daughter chosen was the highest possible honor, a sign of heaven's favor. They could expect rich rewards and a rise in social standing. But for the young girls plucked from their families, often barely into their teens, entry into the imperial harem meant a total rupture with their old lives. They had to leave everything familiar behind and enter into an alien, labyrinthine world of strict rules and rituals not found in any other corner of society. The new recruits spent their days confined within the high red walls of the palace, cut off from family and the outside realm, with an all-female cast of fellow concubines, maids, and eunuch servants. Overseeing them all was the Empress Dowager, mother to the reigning emperor. She ruled the inner palace with an iron fist, governing every minute detail of the concubines' lives. Their mornings began with a ritualized audience before the empress to pay their respects. Their schedules, meals, wardrobes, and duties were micromanaged down to the tiniest of gestures. A new concubine had to learn all the elaborate courtesies of the palace, the correct way to walk, bow, kneel, greet a superior, serve tea. Infractions of etiquette could be harshly punished. So suffocating was the palace atmosphere that many young women fell ill with homesickness and melancholy. There is even a term in Chinese, xi xiang bing, sickness from longing for one's home, that was often used to diagnose newly arrived imperial brides and concubines. One can only imagine the devastating loneliness and alienation these teenagers must have felt, exiled for life in a glittering cage among strangers obsessed with rank and ritual. And yet, some imperial concubines found ways to carve out an existence for themselves within the confines of the palace. They cultivated skills in music, dance, painting, embroidery, and poetry, refined arts that could be used to attract the emperor's interest, but also stave off boredom and solidify their identities. With dedication, a few rose to the highest ranks, wielding considerable influence. Some, like the Song dynasty's Empress Liu, even commanded armies and served as regents for child emperors. These formidable women defied the stereotype of the concubine as a passive vessel valued only for beauty and fertility. They made the best of an oppressive system, playing the game of palace politics with intelligence, resilience, and an instinct for survival. One such woman was Xiao Zhuang, a 17th century concubine of the Qing dynasty emperors Hong Taiji and Shunji. A descendant of the royal family of the Mongol Bojigit clan, she was no shrinking violet. Highly educated, shrewd, and strong-willed, Xiao Zhuang navigated the treacherous currents of the harem intrigue to become one of the most powerful dowager empresses in Chinese history. When her young son Shunji ascended the throne, Xiao Zhuang was the power behind it, advising him on all matters of state. She eliminated her enemies at court, reformed the tax system, and managed foreign relations with the Mongols and Tibetans. Later, as Grand Dowager Empress, she dominated the court through the reign of her grandson Kangxi, one of the greatest emperors of the Qing. He memorialized Xiao Zhuang as the most respected and admired woman of our dynasty. But Xiao Zhuang was an exception that proved the rule. The vast majority of Qing palace women had far less agency over their destinies. By some estimates, at the dynasty's height, there may have been as many as 20,000 concubines in the Forbidden City. Most would live and die unnoticed by the emperor, let alone the official histories. A vanishingly small percentage would ever experience real affection from the Son of Heaven, bear his child, or hold any sway. What did their lives consist of? Tedium, mostly. Waiting endlessly for a summons from the emperor that might never come. Trying to fill the empty hours within the confines of the women's quarters with needlework, letter writing, music, gossip. Scheming to win the emperor's favor or undermine a rival. Praying to bear a son who could change their fortunes. Over time, this toxic combination of monotony, confinement, and vicious internal competition warped even the most virtuous of women. In such a pressure cooker environment, cruelty and pettiness festered. The novelist Pu Songling, in his classic Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio, tells of a new concubine who found a white hair and gleefully showed it to the emperor to tattle on an older consort. Enraged, the emperor ordered the older woman to stay kneeling outdoors in the snow as punishment. Stories abound of concubines using black magic, poisons, or assassins to eliminate their rivals. Some acted out of ruthless ambition, others out of sheer desperation. Even empresses, who in theory had their positions secured, lived in constant fear of being displaced in the emperor's affections by a fresh young beauty. Imagine the pressure of believing your survival depended on keeping an all-powerful man happy, with hundreds of other women waiting to take your place. It's little wonder the imperial harem became a hothouse of neuroses. One of the saddest fates was that of the concubines who found themselves trapped in the purgatory of the so-called Cold Palace. When an emperor died, his childless concubines were often forced to move to a separate section of the Forbidden City to essentially live out the rest of their days in cloistered widowhood, denied any opportunity to remarry or bear children. There they would languish in neglected corners of the palace, forgotten to history, with only the hollow comforts of religion and needlework to sustain them. Occasionally, the curtain is pulled back on their obscure lives. In 2006, an archaeologist discovered a trove of 36 letters by a Ming Dynasty Cold Palace concubine named Dong. Written on silk and concealed for centuries in a palace storeroom, the letters overflow with tender reminiscences of life before entering the palace and bitter laments over the deprivations of her current existence. In one heartbreaking passage, Dong writes to her family, "Worthy younger brother, please send me a jar of pickles, as life in the palace is so miserable. There are many things I'd like to say, but there's no point in saying them aloud." The yearnings and regrets expressed by consort Dong still resonate across the centuries. For so many concubines, imperial service meant an irrevocable loss of family, of autonomy, of identity itself. The great mass of them would never attain the glory of Yang Guifei or the influence of Xiaozhuang. They were powerless pawns in the games of emperors and dynasties, sacrificed on the altar of a merciless system. One can't help but feel sorrow for their stunted, unlived lives. And yet, as we drift off to sleep, their restless ghosts seem to whisper to us still. In the faded grandeur of a crumbling palace, an old woman in silk robes dreams of the distant village of her childhood. A girl with bound feet and a furtive smile awaits her tryst with a handsome soldier in a moonlit garden. An empress's laughter echoes down a gilded corridor. Their stories, even the tragic ones, especially the tragic ones, keep their memory alive in all their flawed and striving humanity. Because for those to whom history denied a voice, a legacy, perhaps the only immortality, lies in the telling. The lonely last years of imperial noble consort Zhen are a poignant example of the precariousness of a concubine's position. Even one who had basked in the glow of an emperor's love was never immune from losing everything in an instant. Born into the Tatara clan, a family of Manchu nobility, the future consort caught the eye of the young Emperor Xianfeng with her beauty and lively wit. Distinguishing herself from the other women of the harem, she rose swiftly through the ranks to become noble consort, receiving the name Yi Zhen, virtuous treasure. For years, she enjoyed a deep emotional bond with the emperor and great prestige in the palace. Paintings from the time show her with an enigmatic smile playing about her lips, her eyes glinting with the confidence of one who knows she is beloved and secure in her position. But in the turbulent final years of the Xianfeng era, that security proved all too illusory. With the emperor's health failing and court intrigue at a fever pitch, the now named consort Zhen found herself out of favor through no fault of her own. Factions maneuvered to isolate her from Xianfeng, manipulating his suspicions. Grieving and anxious, the emperor began to withdraw from his once cherished companion. Where once there had been easy intimacy between them, now there was only cold formality on his increasingly rare visits to her quarters. After Emperor Xianfeng's death, consort Zhen's position grew even more vulnerable in the vicious jockeying for power among the regents. Sidelined and powerless, she could only watch as her enemies seized control. In a final indignity, the regent Prince Gong dismissed her from the palace, ordering her to retire to a Buddhist nunnery. One can imagine the bleak despair of the consort's final years, banished alone to an ascetic life so far from the glittering world she had known. The silence of the nunnery must have echoed with the ghostly revenants of her past glories, the whispered intimacies with a doting emperor, the swish of priceless silks, the click of rosewood mahjong tiles on languorous afternoons in the palace pavilions. All those golden memories turn to ashes now. Gazing at the bare walls of her convent cell, did she wonder what might have been if the emperor had lived, or if she had borne him a son? Did she rage against the fickleness of fate that had raised her so high, only to dash her down again? Or did she find some final peace in the Buddha's teaching that all worldly things, even an emperor's favor, are fleeting and insubstantial? History does not record consort Zhen's inner thoughts in those twilight years. But her story is a testament to the hard truth that even reaching the pinnacle of a consort's ambitions was no guarantee of lasting status or security. In the imperial harem, a woman's position was only as solid as the whims of men, husbands, princes, regents, who saw her as a pawn in their power plays. The same tides of fortune and politics that could lift a concubine up could just as easily sweep her away again, leaving her with nothing but memories of vanished glory. As much as we may be dazzled by the romantic tales of great love affairs between emperors and their concubines, Yi Zhen's melancholy end reminds us that there were no fairy tale happily ever afters, even for the most favored. Whether she died embittered or resigned to her fate, this once lively and ambitious woman spent her final years in obscurity, far from the laughter and scheming of the harem, another discarded player in the brutal games of dynastic politics. The fates of women like imperial noble consort Yi Zhen offer a sobering counterpoint to the glamorized popular image of imperial concubines, so often reduced to stereotypes of the scheming seductress or the innocent ingenue. In truth, even the most successful among them faced a precarious, prescribed existence, their lives shadowed always by the knowledge that power and glory of any kind could be snatched away as abruptly as it had been granted. In the end, perhaps, it was not poison or heartbreak that posed the gravest danger to an imperial concubine, but the cruel awareness of her own vulnerability and expendability. To maintain any semblance of status and security required a constant, exhausting hypervigilance and maneuvering in the treacherous currents of harem intrigue. And even that was no true protection against the ever-looming possibility of abandonment, demotion, or exile when the political winds shifted. From the long perspective of history, the glittering splendor of their jewels and silks and palatial chambers fades away, and we are left with a darker, sadder truth, that for all their proximity to the pinnacle of worldly power, most of the women of the harem remained powerless to determine their own fates, playthings of the dynastic game. In their triumphs and in their tragedies, their stories speak to us across the centuries of the cruelty of systems that treated women as little more than ornaments and vessels. But by striving to understand the complexity and pathos of their experiences, we can restore to them some of the humanity that those systems denied. The echoes of their laughter and their tears, their ambitions and their losses, their fleeting joys and their wasting sorrows, still haunt the silent halls of vanished palaces, waiting for history to honor the women they really were, beneath the heavy robes and headdresses of prescribed roles. In listening to those ghostly whispers, we ensure that their lives were not lost in vain to the crushing weight of the imperial machine. So let us remember, imperial noble consort Yi Zhen and the countless forgotten sisters who shared her fate, the bright-eyed girls who entered the forbidden city full of trepidation and hope, the women who schemed and struggled and too often suffered there, the old survivors bent beneath the sorrows of a long and lonely life behind the high red walls. In reclaiming their stories from the shadows, we give their silent struggles meaning at last. And in mourning the tragedy of their oppression, we vow to build a world where women's lives and voices will never again be so confined and silenced. As we have journeyed through the sprawling yet stifling world of the imperial harem, I hope I have illuminated for you the real lives and fates of the women who inhabited it, not the romanticized, eroticized fantasies of popular imagination, but the far harsher truths of their day-to-day existence, hemmed in by towering walls and suffocating protocols, pitted against each other in endless rivalry for the fickle favor of men, valued solely for their beauty and fertility. These were women trapped in a gilded cage for all the luxury and prestige that gilding promised. Constrained and commodified, concubines lived always at the mercy of systems and individuals that saw them as nothing more than ornaments and instruments of dynastic agendas. Regarded more as possessions than as people, their glittering chambers were in truth little more than prisons, their celebrated romances with emperors ultimately tenuous and conditional. To be an imperial consort, even one who ascended to the peak of that perilous hierarchy, was to know always that your status and security depended entirely on the whims and fortunes of men locked in their own webs of ruthless power struggle. It was to be a pawn on a treacherous chessboard, a piece to be deployed and discarded in the endless games of ambition that roiled beneath the placid surface of palace life. The brave, resilient, striving women who navigated those turbulent waters deserve to be remembered in their full humanity, not merely as the passive objects of men's desires or the convenient villains of history. They laughed, schemed, wept, dreamed, despaired, and through it all endured the unendurable with a fortitude that should stir us still, even as we mourn the cruelties and constrictions that so circumscribed their lives. In the end, the true tragedy of an imperial consort was not the possibility of being cast aside by a fickle emperor or falling victim to a ruthless rival. It was the inescapable awareness that, no matter how high she might rise, or how deep her bond with the Son of Heaven, she remained always a prisoner of the system that had ensnared her, an ornament and instrument in the hands of men whose own power was absolute and unquestionable. The consorts and concubines of the Forbidden City existed in a gilded cage, and no amount of sumptuous trappings could entirely conceal the cold reality of the bars. However much we may thrill to tales of palace romance and intrigue, we must remember always the brutal truths that underlay them, the institutional powerlessness and prescription that even the most exalted could never fully escape. In the lonely last days of a banished consort, or the choking despair of a discarded favorite, we hear the whispered testimony of the price these women paid for their proximity to power, and the lingering sorrow of lives unlived beyond the high, confining walls of the inner palace. As we bid them farewell and draw the curtain on the harem's hushed, cloistered world, let us honor their memory by hearing at last the voices those walls were meant to muffle. Let us celebrate their triumphs and mourn their tragedies, and in doing so, affirm the worth of the vibrant individual lives the imperial system sought to crush and control. The echoes of those lives still haunt the silent halls and windswept pavilions where these women schemed and struggled and endured. In the desolation of an empty throne room or a ruined consort's chamber, their ghosts seem to whisper still of the truth that history so often obscures, that within the rigid machine of dynastic power, there beat the yearning hearts of real women, with all the soaring passions and shattering frailties of their sex. If, in our imagination, we can people again those vanished palaces with their laughter and their tears, their fleeting joys and wasting sorrows, then the long centuries of their oppression will not have been in vain. And in the stillness of a moonlit night in the Forbidden City, as the wind sighs secrets through the ancient pines, perhaps we can sense them there beside us, the ghosts of the harem women, hopeful girls and weary survivors, faded beauties and tragic suicides, all the forgotten heroines of a drama whose grand themes of love and loss, ambition and oppression still resonate in our own age. Let us give them in death what they were so often denied in life, a true acknowledgement of their humanity and an honouring of the silent sacrifices we can only begin to fathom. In that act of remembrance and compassion, their long captivity ends at last. As the young concubine settled into her new life in the palace, she quickly learned that her humble origins put her at a disadvantage. Many of the other women came from noble families and had been training for this role their entire lives. They knew how to navigate the complex web of palace etiquette and politics, while she stumbled through the unfamiliar customs, rules, and expectations. The senior concubines and consorts, already secure in their positions, took every opportunity to put the newcomer in her place. They mocked her country accent, her clumsy attempts at court fashion, her ignorance of palace gossip and intrigues. She endured cutting remarks and condescending lectures, biting her tongue lest any impudent response make her situation even worse. There were so many potential landmines in palace interactions. Using the wrong title, making eye contact when she shouldn't, failing to bow deeply enough to a higher-ranked mistress. Any small misstep could earn a harsh scolding or punishment from the offended party. She watched some of her fellow junior concubines ordered to kneel for hours or slapped across the face for minor transgressions. The threat of physical discipline loomed over them all. The young woman struggled to keep all the rules and hierarchies straight. There were 8 main ranks of concubines, each with their own status and privileges. Some, like the imperial noble consorts, had almost as much prestige as the empress herself, while lowly concubines like her barely registered as blips in the palace ecosystem. Survival meant learning her place in the pecking order and showing proper deference to all those above her. That included not just the emperor's women, but a labyrinth of palace officials, dowager queens, and even senior maids and eunuchs who could easily make a concubine's life miserable if given any offense. Favor and promotions were earned through carefully staying in your lane. She had to remake herself into a refined lady of the court, shedding any trace of her commoner background. That meant endless lessons in everything from poetry and calligraphy to tea ceremonies and imperial court dances. Her country dialect was painstakingly corrected and her rural manners polished away. It was exhausting trying to bend herself to fit this lofty imperial mold. Some nights she lay awake in the dark, bones aching from kneeling, feet throbbing from all the bowing and balancing. So much of her old self, the laughing, carefree girl she used to be, had to be pruned away, replaced by this demure, obedient palace creature. There were whispers about what happened to concubines who failed to adapt. The ones who just couldn't seem to grasp the rules, stay in line, and transform themselves into sophisticated court ladies. Eventually, they would disappear from the palace, quietly expelled in disgrace, sent to live out their days in some far-flung province. The unluckiest ones, it was said, were condemned as failures and secretly executed. All it took was some repeated offense or impertinence to justify getting rid of a troublesome low-ranking concubine. These were just rumors, of course, palace gossip not to be taken too seriously. Still, they added to the climate of unease. Bit by bit, the bewildered country girl learned to bury her true self, to speak, act, and even think like a member of this rarefied world. It was a difficult, even traumatic adjustment. But what choice did she have? This was her life now, for better or worse. The palace was her home, her universe, her prison. She wasn't the first young concubine to be thrown into the deep end of court life, and she wouldn't be the last. Behind the palace walls, women were reborn or broken by the force of imperial molds. In the struggle to adapt and survive, many quietly suffocated their old identities. For some, killing off their past selves was the only way to endure the present. They hardened themselves, becoming ruthless players in the harem game, willing to betray and sabotage their sister wives if it meant getting ahead. Others numbed themselves into passive followers, empty vessels for palace rules and protocols. Then there were those who took the transformation to heart, finding a kind of belonging and purpose in perfecting the role of imperial mistress. They took pride in their exquisite mastery of court graces and their embodiment of harem ideals. metamorphosis complete. However they coped, that loss of self, that rupture with their pasts, took a profound toll. Even the most successful harem women, the ones who ascended to the pinnacles of palace status, paid a price. Buried traumas had ways of resurfacing, and the echoes of abandoned dreams and lost identities lingered as dull aches. Our young concubine swallowed those losses as the years flowed by. She learned and adapted, donning her persona as an imperial mistress like armor against the casual cruelties and corrosive atmosphere of palace life. In transforming herself, she found a way to survive. But some vital spark, some core sense of self, grew fainter with each passing season. It would be many years before she could admit, even to herself, how much that severing of her roots, that burial of her true self, truly cost her. How a part of her withered in captivity, even as she mastered the role of court lady. That internal void would ache and twinge for a lifetime. But those insights came later, after decades of harem life wore away her illusions. In those early days, all her energy went into the wrenching metamorphosis from country girl to palace concubine, into learning the Byzantine ways of her gilded cage and appeasing her imperial keepers. Small victories, like memorizing the proper court greetings or being praised for her tea-pouring skills, stood out like bright moments in the lusterless toil of transforming herself. They were fragile affirmations that maybe, with enough effort and sacrifice, she could craft an acceptable place for herself in this forbidding world. The scheming and betrayals that swirled through the palace harem could reach truly operatic proportions. Take the tale of Consort Qi, who ruthlessly plotted the downfall of her chief rival, Consort Feng. Consort Feng was a renowned beauty, known for her gentle nature and devotion to the arts. She quickly became a favorite of the Yongzheng emperor, spending many intimate evenings playing music for him in his private chambers. But this growing closeness did not go unnoticed by the other concubines, especially the prideful and ambitious Consort Qi. Qi had entered the palace at a young age and clawed her way up the hierarchy through a combination of wiles, seduction, and carefully cultivated connections with powerful eunuchs and dowager consorts. She bitterly resented playing second fiddle to the more modest and unassuming Consort Feng. So Consort Qi hatched a devious scheme to frame her rival for theft. She bribed a palace maid to plant one of the emperor's precious antique jade carvings in Feng's chambers. Then Qi tipped off the emperor about the supposed theft. When the incriminating jade piece was discovered in Consort Feng's room, the emperor flew into a terrible rage, refusing to believe Feng's protestations of innocence. He immediately had the hapless consort, Feng, dragged away in disgrace and imprisoned. Overnight, Feng went from the emperor's cherished companion to reviled criminal. She was demoted to the lowest rank of consort and exiled to a distant wing of the palace, her fine robes and jewels stripped away. Meanwhile, with her competitor out of the way, Consort Qi quickly maneuvered herself into the vacant place by the emperor's side. For a time, she basked in the glow of his favor and the resentful envy of the other concubines. But karmic retribution has a way of catching up to even the most artful palace schemers. A few years later, the same palace maid who had helped Consort Qi frame her rival had a change of heart. Racked by guilt, the maid confessed the whole sordid plot to the emperor. In a poetic reversal of fortunes, it was Consort Qi who now found herself dragged before the furious emperor to answer for her treachery. She was beaten severely and then banished from the palace altogether to live out her days in obscurity and disgrace. As for Consort Feng, she was restored to her former rank and allowed to return to the emperor's good graces. But the scars left by her rival's betrayal never fully healed. According to palace legend, on moonlit nights, the tragic strains of Feng's erhu could sometimes be heard drifting through the palace courtyards, the exquisite melodies tinged with an unmistakable undercurrent of sorrow. Such was the precarious and often poisonous world of the imperial harem, where today's victor could swiftly become tomorrow's vanquished. For even the most favored concubines, power and glory could be fleeting, while resentments festered behind every painted smile. Of course, the greatest ambition a concubine could harbor was to bear the emperor a son. In a world where wives and consorts were ultimately valued for their fertility above all, producing an heir was the one guaranteed path to securing an unassailable position. But the road to motherhood was far from easy for the women of the imperial harem. Becoming pregnant with the emperor's child was an unpredictable affair, subject to the whims of nature and the emperor's fickle attentions. A concubine could enjoy a run of nights in the emperor's bed only to be abruptly displaced when a new beauty caught his eye. For those concubines who did successfully conceive, their trials were only beginning. Childbirth in Imperial China was a perilous undertaking, with limited understanding of hygiene and medicine. Too often, a much-awaited infant arrived stillborn, or else a labouring mother succumbed to hemorrhage or childbed fever. Even concubines who safely delivered a robust baby lived in fear that their child might fall sick and die in infancy, as so many did in those times. Until her son grew old enough to thrive and take his rightful place as heir, a royal mother could never rest completely secure. Among the thousands of hopeful young women who entered the palace gates as concubines, vanishingly few ever attained the apogee of bearing the emperor a son who lived to adulthood and one day took the throne himself. For those rare victors, the rewards of power and prestige were beyond imagination. But for the vast majority, the promise of motherhood proved achingly elusive. The melancholy case of Consort Rong is a poignant illustration of the sorrows that could befall even the most promising of imperial mothers. A daughter of a noble Han Chinese family, the lovely and cultured Rong caught the eye of the Qianlong Emperor as a teenage girl. He was so besotted with his new concubine that he lavished her with gifts and had her portrait painted more times than any of his other consorts. Soon, the delighted emperor received the news that his favorite was expecting a child. The entire court waited with great anticipation to see if the radiant young concubine would present the Qianlong Emperor with the ultimate prize, a male heir. But sadly, it was not to be. Sometime during her second trimester, Consort Rong suffered a devastating miscarriage, losing the precious baby boy she carried. The emperor was grieved by the loss of his child, but he consoled the devastated Rong that they were still young and could try again for another son. Alas, despite her fervent prayers to the goddess Guan Yin, Consort Rong's next two pregnancies also ended in miscarriage. With each loss, she sank deeper into despair, convinced that she had somehow angered the gods and was being punished for an unknown sin. By the time she conceived a fourth time, the emperor's ardor had cooled considerably and he had turned his attentions to a new bevy of younger, more vivacious concubines. Lonely and filled with trepidation, Consort Rong spent a fearful 9 months hardly daring to hope that this final chance at motherhood would succeed. When her pains began, she laboured for 2 excruciating days before finally delivering a small but living infant. But her joy was short-lived, for it soon became apparent that something was terribly wrong. The baby, a boy, was sickly and would not suckle. The imperial physicians shook their heads gravely. The little prince's prospects did not look good. For 3 anxiety-filled months, Consort Rong devoted herself to the care of her fragile son, nursing him around the clock and supervising his every treatment. Surely, she told herself, if she just poured enough love and prayers into his tiny body, she could will him to live. But it was not to be. On a bleak winter morning, the little prince drew his last laboured breath and slipped away, leaving his mother broken-hearted and bereft. All her hopes for a child to love, and for the glory of being the mother of an emperor, crumbled to ashes. Thereafter, whenever the emperor visited Consort Rong's elegantly appointed quarters, he found her listless and withdrawn, no longer the enchanting companion he had once so adored. After a while, his visits tapered off and then ceased altogether. Consort Rong spent her remaining years in the palace drifting like a ghost through the halls, forever trailing the invisible weight of her grief behind her. Hers is but one heart-rending story of the women whose hard-fought path to motherhood was destined to end in sorrow. In the imperial harem, the line between triumph and tragedy could be painfully thin indeed. The ancient Chinese believed that emperors were the sons of heaven, their rule ordained by the mandate of divine authorities. But with such supreme power, inevitably, came earthly temptations and indulgences. The imperial harem, where the emperor could house hundreds or even thousands of beautiful women to serve his every whim and desire, was the ultimate symbol of both his lofty status and very human appetites. From the Tang to the Qing dynasty, generations of emperors relied on the institution of concubinage to satisfy their wants and ensure a plentiful supply of male heirs to continue their royal line. But behind its veneer of luxury and prestige, life in the harem was a gilded cage for the women confined there. Most were pawns in a much larger game, their fates yoked to the fickle favor of one man. Take the story of Consort Qi, a minor concubine during the reign of Qing Emperor Daoguang. Born into a lowly bannerman family, the young girl's beauty caught the eye of imperial scouts. At the tender age of 13, she was taken from her family home and thrust into the alien world of the Forbidden City. Imagine the culture shock of a sheltered teenage girl, accustomed to the humble routines of rural life, suddenly having to navigate the labyrinthine rules and customs of the palace. Even the simplest tasks like eating, bathing, and dressing were rigidly prescribed by rank and protocol. One misstep could bring humiliating punishment. At first, Qi floundered in this cold and forbidding place, so far from everything familiar. Lonely and homesick, she struggled to adapt to the regimented lifestyle and meticulous palace etiquette. The other women, wary of fresh-faced newcomers who might steal the emperor's attentions, gave her the cold shoulder. But over time, the clever girl learned to survive, even thrive, in her new surroundings. She cultivated allies among the senior servants and memorized the intricate social codes that governed harem life. Most importantly, she mastered the subtle art of pleasing the emperor. Her diligence paid off when she was promoted to a higher rank and moved into her own lavish quarters. Yet even as Consort Qi grew accustomed to palace life, she realized the suffocating constraints of her new position. The women of the harem were all rivals for the rarest and most precious resource of all, the emperor's favor. They schemed endlessly to outmaneuver one another, using every weapon at their disposal: beauty, flattery, sex, even treachery and black magic. It was not uncommon for imperial concubines to befriend palace eunuchs, who could serve as spies and allies in their intrigues. Qi heard dark rumors of concubines who bribed eunuchs to poison or curse their rivals. The threat of betrayal lurked around every painted screen and shadowed courtyard. Higher rank brought some protection from the pettiest cruelties and drudge work inflicted on junior concubines. But it also meant a more direct line of fire in the vicious conflicts between consorts. Even the most favored woman could find herself cast out if a new competitor caught the emperor's eye, or she ran afoul of plotting ministers and in-laws. In such a precarious position, bearing children was an imperial concubine's best chance at security. Sons were prized above all else, as only they could carry on the royal bloodline. But conceiving was no simple matter. With so many women and so few opportunities to serve the emperor, becoming pregnant was like winning a cruel lottery. Even then, the dangers were not over. childbirth in the palace was a perilous undertaking in an age of rudimentary obstetrics. Many mothers and babies did not survive the ordeal. Consort Qi herself endured 3 miscarriages and a stillbirth before finally delivering a healthy baby boy. In her relief, she dared to dream of a brighter future at last. Alas, those hopes proved short-lived. As her little prince grew, palace gossip began to whisper that he bore an uncanny resemblance to the emperor's younger brother. Consort Qi found herself accused of conducting an illicit affair, a treasonous offence. Whether the allegations were true or just malicious slander mattered little. Enraged, the emperor had her brutally flogged and expelled from the palace. Cast out into the streets, Qi was spared execution only because of her son. Her family, fearing the emperor's wrath, would not take her in. With nowhere else to turn, the forlorn concubine became a nun and spent the rest of her days in an obscure temple. It's said that she wept for her lost child every day until her lonely death. Consort Qi's tragic tale was just one of countless stories of promising young girls whose lives were upended when they entered the emperor's harem. Most did not even attain the fleeting glory she had before her calamitous fall from grace. They lived and died within the high red walls of the Forbidden City, unknown and unremarked by history. The luckiest among them enjoyed some measure of comfort and prestige as favoured concubines. They had sumptuous quarters, fine clothes and food, and small armies of servants to attend to their every need. Some even wielded a measure of influence from behind the scenes. But that influence was always precarious and could vanish in an instant with the emperor's changing affections. More often, life in the palace was monotonous and suffocating, full of elaborate rituals and stifling decorum to while away the long days. Imperial concubines led cloistered existences, rarely allowed to venture beyond the palace gates. They could never marry for love or choose their own fates. Even their families benefited little from their positions, seldom sharing in their newfound status. And in tumultuous times, when rival factions warred for power or dynasties crumbled, concubines could find themselves treated as little more than political currency. Ambitious ministers and generals fought over beautiful consorts like trophies. In the worst upheavals, entire harems could be put to the sword by rebel forces or invading armies. During the Tang dynasty, a period of relative openness and cosmopolitanism, concubines from distant lands like Japan and Korea were brought to the imperial court as goodwill gifts and diplomatic tributes. One such girl was Yang Guifei, a half-Turkish, half-Persian beauty, said to have a face that could eclipse the moon. Guifei swiftly became the emperor's favorite, rising to unparalleled power and prestige. But her foreign origins and decadent influence made her deeply unpopular at court. When a military revolt threatened the capital, enraged officials demanded her head. Heartbroken, the emperor reluctantly ordered his beloved concubine strangled to appease the rebels. Hers was a more dramatic end than most concubines met, but no less tragic. For all their silk and jewels and proximity to power, life as an imperial concubine was little better than that of a bird in a gilded cage, pampered and privileged, but never truly free. Most never found real love, joy, or fulfillment. At best, they were ornaments, pleasant distractions to entertain the emperor. At worst, they were pawns in a ruthless game where they had no agency. In their final years, as their youth and beauty faded, many must have looked back on lives filled with loneliness and regret. What dreams and aspirations had they surrendered when they passed through the palace gates? What might they have experienced and achieved beyond the stifling confines of the harem? Those questions, like so much of their lives, went forever unanswered as they died as quietly as they had lived. The poignant stories of Consort Qi, Yang Guifei, and countless other imperial concubines offer us a glimpse beneath the dazzling veneer of China's royal court. They complicate the conventional image of the palace harem as a sensual paradise and remind us of the human costs of unchecked power and luxury. In many ways, the harem was a mirror for Imperial China itself, a place of great splendor and sophistication built on deep inequality and shocking brutality. The forgotten sacrifices and cut-short lives of generations of concubines are a testament to the dark underside of a civilization that continues to loom large in the popular imagination. But in the end, perhaps these women's enduring allure lies in their sheer humanity. For all the palace intrigues and rigid hierarchies that defined their existences, they were real individuals with fears, desires, and all too fragile hopes and dreams. Though they lived in the long-ago world of emperors and dynasties, the yearnings and disappointments they experienced were deeply relatable and timeless. In that sense, their stories still have much to teach us. Not just about the vanished glory of Imperial China, but about the triumphs and tragedies of the human spirit itself. As we've seen, life as an imperial concubine in China was often a lonely and unfulfilling existence, full of perils both political and personal. Even those women who managed to catch the emperor's eye and bear his children could never feel secure in their positions. Fortunes could reverse in an instant inside the palace walls. Take the story of Consort Qi, who was one of the Yongzheng emperor's favorite concubines in the early 18th century Qing dynasty. Born to a Han Chinese general's family, the young lady who would become Consort Qi was said to be breathtakingly beautiful, with a face like a flower and a graceful willowy figure. She quickly enchanted Emperor Yongzheng with her classical talents in poetry, painting and music. Unlike many concubines who had to scheme and fight for the smallest scrap of affection, Consort Qi enjoyed the emperor's doting attention. He bestowed upon her lavish gifts, from jeweled hairpins to carved jade objects, and even commissioned a portrait of her to be painted by the famed Italian Jesuit artist Giuseppe Castiglione. But Consort Qi was to suffer immense personal tragedies. She became pregnant 3 times, but the first ended in a miscarriage, and the second resulted in the birth of a daughter. In the relentless pressure cooker of the imperial harem, giving birth to a daughter was seen as a disappointment at best, and at worst, a potential threat to a concubine's status. It was only with the birth of a son, Prince Hongzhou, that Consort Qi seemed to secure her position. Sadly, the infant prince died before reaching his first birthday, plunging Consort Qi into despair. The emperor, despite his apparent love for her, now kept his distance, his ardor cooled by her failure to provide him a surviving male heir. As so often happened in the imperial harem, a formerly favored concubine found herself sidelined and neglected. Only a few years later, Emperor Yongzheng himself suddenly died, leaving the throne to his son by another concubine. In the brutal tradition of palace successions, Consort Qi was cast out by the new emperor, forced to leave the glittering luxury of court for a Buddhist nunnery, where she was to live out the rest of her days. We can only imagine the trauma of being ripped away from the only home she had known for decades, severed from her one remaining daughter, and abandoned by the court that had once exalted her. The story of Consort Qi is just one small thread in the vast tapestry of sorrow that so many generations of imperial concubines experienced. These were women from all walks of life, some born to privilege and others to poverty, but all ultimately shared the same fate of being used as vessels and adornments for the emperor and the dynasty. They were pawns in a much greater game of power, where their individual desires counted for little. And yet, as we drift off to sleep tonight, it's worth remembering that each of these countless concubines was a living, breathing, feeling human being, with her own dreams and dreads, loves and losses. Though they lived their lives behind high crimson palace walls, rarely recorded in official histories, the whispers of their stories still reach us centuries later. The midnight intrigues, the valiant struggles to survive in a system stacked against them, their few triumphs and many tribulations, these are all part of the bittersweet hidden history of China's imperial concubines. So the next time you see a TV drama or read a novel romanticizing the lush, steamy world of the imperial harem, spare a thought for the real women who lived and died within it. They were not, for the most part, conniving seductresses or helpless victims, but complex human beings making hard choices within suffocating constraints. In recognizing the harsh realities they endured, we pay tribute to their inner strength and resilience. The institution of concubinage cast a long shadow over Chinese history, one that stretched for thousands of years and over many dynasties. It shaped the lives of countless individuals, from the son of heaven on his dragon throne to the lowest kitchen maid who dreamed of a better future for her daughter. Its influence could even be felt beyond China's borders, in the kingdoms that sent their princess daughters to cement alliances with the emperor. But as the Qing dynasty crumbled in the early 20th century, so too did the system of imperial concubinage that had propped it up for so long. The last emperor of China, Puyi, was forced to expel the remaining palace women when the Japanese invaded in the 1930s. It was an ignominious end to an institution that had once seemed as eternal and unassailable as the Forbidden City itself. In the decades since the fall of the last dynasty, China has undergone wrenching revolutions and mind-boggling transformations. The cloistered, cosseted world of the imperial concubines now seems as distant as a dream, a half-forgotten relic of a past that many would prefer to leave behind. And yet, the stories of these women continue to resonate through time, offering us a window into a world at once alien and achingly familiar. For all the silken spices, the palatial gardens and exquisite furnishings, the life of an imperial concubine was in many ways a life of emptiness and sorrow. These lucky women who had the misfortune to catch the emperor's eye often found that the splendor of their surroundings only heightened their sense of isolation and powerlessness. They were denied the basic human freedoms, to love, to choose their own fates, to find meaning and purpose beyond the narrowly circumscribed roles assigned to them. But even in the depths of their despair, some concubines managed to leave a mark on history. There were poets and artists who poured their sorrows into their work, leaving behind a legacy of haunting beauty. There were mothers who fought tooth and nail to secure a better future for their children, playing the ruthless game of court politics with skill and determination. And there were women who simply endured day after day, year after year, maintaining their dignity and humanity in the face of unimaginable hardships. As we close our eyes and drift off to sleep, let us hold a space in our hearts for these long-ago women, our sisters across the centuries. May their stories remind us to cherish the freedoms we so often take for granted, and to honor the quiet acts of courage and resilience that have always sustained the human spirit, even in the darkest of times. The red walls of the Forbidden City still stand in Beijing, a silent testament to the vanished world of the emperors and their concubines. But the real monument to these women is the one we carry within us, the empathy and compassion that allows us to reach across the barriers of time and culture, to recognize their struggles and their strength, their pain and their perseverance. In the end, perhaps this is the most enduring legacy of the imperial concubines. Not the sons they bore or the intrigues they wove, but the way their stories continue to move us, to trouble us, to make us ask the deep questions about power and gender, about the human cost of mighty empires and glittering palaces. They remind us that beneath the sweeping currents of history, there have always been individual lives, individual loves and losses, individual triumphs and tragedies. And as we surrender to sleep's embrace, we carry a piece of their stories with us, woven now into the fabric of our own dreams. May we dream of a world where no woman is ever again trapped in a gilded cage, where no human being is ever again reduced to a pawn in someone else's game, may we dream of a world where every person, regardless of birth or circumstance, has the freedom to write their own story, to pursue their own path to happiness and fulfillment. This is the world that the Imperial Concubines, in their own small way, help to dream into being through their struggles and their sacrifices. It's a dream that remains unfinished, a work in progress that we are all called to carry forward. But as we do so, let us remember the women who came before us, the ones who endured so much in the hidden corners of history. Let their memory be a blessing and a guidepost, a reminder of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. And let their stories whisper to us as we slip into sleep's gentle darkness, like the ghost of a long-ago lullaby, half remembered and half imagined, echoing softly through the ages. The life of an imperial concubine in China was often marked by intense loneliness, despite being surrounded by the hundreds or even thousands of people who inhabited the palace. For most concubines, contact with the emperor was sporadic at best. Weeks, months, or even years could pass without being summoned to his bedchamber. The vast majority never attained the status of a favored consort or the mother of the emperor's children. Instead, they lived out their days in the stultifying tedium and stifling seclusion of the harem. Days were filled with little to occupy the concubine's time or talents. As women of the palace, they were barred from outside society. There was needlework to be done, instruments to be practiced, and poetry and calligraphy to perfect. But without the stimulation and variety of the wider world, the palace became a gilded cage of crushing boredom for many concubines. Friendships with other palace women might be cultivated, but the cutthroat competition for status meant that true connection was rare and risky. Any confidant could later become a bitter rival. Most crushing of all was the lack of genuine bonds of family and affection. Relationships with family and hometown friends were severed when a young woman entered the palace, often never to be seen again. Any children she bore the emperor would be raised by nannies and tutors, with the mother's role only occasional and distant. Most concubines never had the chance to experience romantic love, as their only sanctioned outlet was an emperor they barely saw and who had hundreds of other women to choose from. Even the rare concubine who gained the emperor's special favor could lose it as quickly as she had won it. The story of Consort Qi, a concubine during the reign of the Qianlong emperor, poignantly illustrates the loneliness and sorrow that were so often the lot of these trapped palace women. As a young girl from a scholar-official family fallen on hard times, Qi was selected for the imperial harem for her intelligence and musical talents, as well as her beauty. She quickly became known in the palace for her skill on the guzheng, or Chinese zither. Her music so captivated the emperor that she rose to become one of his favored consorts. But Consort Qi's charmed life was not to last. Court politics and harem rivalries were a constant peril. She found herself demoted and out of favor after offending the emperor's higher-ranked empress. Worse still, despite her many years in the emperor's good graces, she had never been able to give him a son. As she entered her 30s, her prospects for conceiving greatly diminished in a time without reliable fertility treatments. The lonely years stretched ahead of her, banished to a far corner of the palace without even the hope of a child to keep her company. Late in life, long after Emperor Qianlong had passed away, Consort Qi penned a melancholy poem reflecting back on her years in the palace. Spring flowers, autumn moon, how many passed me by. Locked in secluded halls, such a small world. The zither's strings are silent now, its case covered in dust. A caged bird longs to spread its wings and sing a song of sorrow. Qi's poignant words speak not only for herself, but for the many generations of imperial concubines whose lives were marked by futility, frustration, and a profound lack of human connection. even at the highest pinnacle of the emperor's favor, true happiness eluded them. The luxuries, status, and pleasures they enjoyed came at the cost of their freedom and personal fulfillment. In the stifling world of the palace, even the most feted beauty was ultimately no more than a bird in a gilded cage. So it was for Wu Rong, a concubine of the 12th century Emperor Gaozong of Song. A renowned poet and painter, Wu caught the emperor's eye with her refinement and soon became his cherished companion. For a few golden years, she basked in his adoration, with her every poem and painting lavishly praised. But Wu had the misfortune to become entangled in the vicious power struggle between the emperor and his chancellor Qin Hui. Falsely accused of using sorcery to bewitch the emperor, the hapless concubine was demoted, expelled from court, and imprisoned. She was only 26. Wu Rong would languish for 2 decades in captivity, her youth and beauty fading within the walls of her confinement. It was an abrupt fall from the dizzying heights of imperial favor into the depths of obscurity and isolation. Even after she was finally released, an embittered Wu chose to live as a hermit rather than return to society. The wounds inflicted by the palace ran too deep. As she wrote in one haunting poem, recalling the splendors of those vanished days, the memory seems like a spring dream that will not stay. That glittering world held only fleeting joys. In the end, this floating life is nothing but void. Wu Rong's tragic tale underscores the capriciousness of fate that stalked even the most exalted imperial consorts. The same palace that had raised her up so high ultimately dashed her back down without mercy. For a flickering moment, she had the love of the most powerful man in China. But in the end, like so many ill-starred concubines before and after her, Wu was only a powerless pawn, to be used and discarded at the whims of men and the machinations of the court. The theme that runs through the lives of women like Consort Qi and Wu Rong is one of yearning for a fuller life beyond the stifling confines of the palace, for lasting bonds of love and family, for a sense of autonomy and control over their own destinies. But for most concubines, these basic human needs remained painfully unfulfilled. The lucky few who found some measure of status, stability, or self-actualization were the exceptions to the rule. More typical was the plight of the fragrant concubine, a title bestowed on a woman named Xiang Fei, who entered the Qing court in the 1760s. Of Uyghur Muslim background from the western borderlands, she was presented as a tribute gift to the Qianlong emperor by a regional ruler. Renamed Fragrant for the pleasing scent said to emanate from her body, she soon became the aging emperor's favorite, doted upon for her fresh beauty and innocent charm. But the fragrant concubine's hold on Qianlong's affections made her a target for the ruthless Empress Dowager. Xiang Fei was tormented, beaten, and eventually murdered on the orders of the envious empress. The emperor buried his beloved concubine in a lavish tomb, but could not even publicly mourn her, constrained by the rigid rules that governed imperial propriety and his duty to the senior empress. The fragrant concubine's bleak end shows how even the most favored consorts were ultimately expendable within the brutal calculus of harem politics. As a naive girl from the provinces thrust into the snake pit of the palace, she never stood a chance. In the end, she was seen by the court not as a person, but as an exotic plaything whose novelty value had expired. This objectification and commodification of women was the common thread that ran through the experience of imperial concubines, from the lowest maids to the highest consorts. They were viewed as adornments and assets, to be collected and discarded at will, rather than as individuals with minds and hearts of their own. This fundamental lack of personhood meant that for all their fineries and luxuries, concubines remained trapped in a silken prison, powerless to determine the course of their own lives. the poignant stories of Consort Qi, Wu Rong, the fragrant concubine, and so many others lost to history shine a light into the shadows of the imperial palace, illuminating the human struggles that played out behind its forbidding walls. For all their proximity to the apex of power and wealth, the vast majority of concubines remained pitiable in their utter lack of real agency or fulfillment. They could only watch mutely from behind the silk screen as the great game of empire played out, forever on the outside looking in. In the end, the loneliness, frustration, and quiet desperation that marked the lives of generations of imperial concubines should make us question the dazzling surface glamour of their rarefied world. Behind the exquisite silks, glittering jewels, and sumptuous surroundings lay a much darker reality of exploitation, isolation, and the crushing of the human spirit. As highly prized commodities in a system designed to serve the needs of men and the dynasty, concubines were ultimately as disposable as they were alluring. Long after China's last dynasty fell and the institution of the imperial harem faded into history, the melancholy echoes of these women's stifled hopes and wasted potential continue to haunt us down through the ages. In recognizing the profoundly circumscribed existences they endured, we restore to them some measure of the dignity and personhood they were so often denied in life. The quiet tragedies of the women of the palace may have been buried by history, but they need not be forgotten. Though gone, their long-ago longings still speak to us across the vast gulf of years, a poignant reminder of the indomitable human yearning for a life of purpose, connection, and meaning. As we've seen, even those concubines who managed to catch the emperor's eye and bear his children were still vulnerable to the ever-shifting winds of palace politics. The story of Consort Qi, a low-born woman who rose to become one of the most favored consorts of the Jiajing emperor in the 16th century, is a poignant example of how precarious a concubine's position could be. Born into a poor family, the young Consort Qi caught the emperor's attention with her beauty and quick wit. She soon found herself elevated to the rank of noble consort, showered with gifts and privileges. For a time, it seemed she could do no wrong in the emperor's eyes. She bore him a son, cementing her status, and the future looked bright. But palace intrigue is ever present, and Consort Qi had made enemies during her meteoric rise. The emperor's first wife, Empress Zhang, resented the newcomer who had stolen her husband's affections. When the empress's father, a powerful official, fell out of political favor, Empress Zhang seized the opportunity to exact revenge on her rival. Whispers began to reach the emperor's ears, rumors that Consort Qi was growing arrogant, putting on airs unbefitting her humble origins. Petty faults were exaggerated into grave transgressions. The emperor, growing older and more paranoid, began to doubt the woman he had once cherished. In a palace coup, Empress Zhang and her allies moved against Consort Qi. Trumped-up charges of disrespect and disloyalty were brought against her. Despite her pleas and protestations of innocence, the emperor, swayed by the empress's faction, demoted Consort Qi and had her imprisoned. Stripped of her rank and privileges, separated from her young son, Consort Qi spent her remaining years languishing in the cold palace, the part of the imperial harem reserved for out-of-favor concubines. She lived out her days in lonely obscurity, a once shining star now consigned to the shadows. Consort Qi's tale is a reminder of the knife's edge that imperial concubines walked. One moment a woman could bask in the glow of the emperor's adoration. The next, she could find herself cast aside. All her glories turned to ashes. The game of palace politics was a treacherous one, and even the winners could quickly become the losers. In our final story, we turn to the turbulent years of the late Ming dynasty in the 17th century. As rebel forces closed in on the capital and the imperial court descended into chaos, the palace concubines found themselves tragically caught up in events beyond their control. The Chongzhen emperor, the last ruler of the Ming, was a paranoid and erratic figure. As his grip on power crumbled and his enemies approached the gates, he lashed out at those around him, seeing conspiracies and treachery on all sides. In a fit of desperation and madness, the emperor ordered the mass suicide of the palace concubines, convinced they would otherwise fall into the hands of the invading rebels. The women, most of them no more than powerless pawns in the game of dynasties, had no choice but to comply. On the night of April 25th, 1644, the concubines dressed in their finest robes and jewelry for the last time. In a grim ceremony, they drank poison from small silver cups, their lifeless bodies arrayed around the imperial chambers. The emperor, his wife, and his closest courtiers followed suit, bringing an end to the once glorious Ming dynasty in a final orgy of violence and despair. It was a tragic and senseless end for the hundreds of palace women who died that night. Most had entered the imperial harem full of hopes and dreams, only to find those dreams dashed against the cold realities of court life. In their final moments, they were stripped of even the small modicum of agency and dignity they had clung to. As the dawn rose over an empire in turmoil, the bodies of the loyal concubines lay still and silent, mute testaments to the cruelty and capriciousness of the system that had consumed their lives. Their sad fate is a poignant reminder of the human toll exacted by the glittering facade of imperial power. Throughout this series, we've traced the stories of the concubines who lived and died in the palaces of Imperial China. Though they came from different backgrounds and met various ends, their experiences speak to the common themes of powerlessness, loneliness, and thwarted hopes that defined so many of their lives. For all the romantic myths and literary fantasies surrounding the imperial harem, the reality for most concubines was a far cry from the beguiling tales of passion and intrigue. Beneath the sumptuous robes and glittering jewels lay a world of cutthroat rivalry, precarious fortunes, and stifling restrictions. The lucky few ascended to dizzying heights of favor and status, but even they walked a tightrope, always one wrong move away from disgrace and ruin. The unlucky ones whiled away their years in obscurity and frustration, their youth and beauty squandered in service to a system that saw them as little more than disposable vessels. In the end, the institution of concubinage in Imperial China was a mirror for the society that created it, a world of rigid hierarchies, capricious power, and glaring inequities between men and women. The stories of the concubines, at once fascinating and heartbreaking, offer us a glimpse into this vanished world and a poignant reminder of the human costs of unchecked power and privilege. As we close out this series, I hope these tales of the women who lived and loved and suffered in the imperial palaces have shed some light on a little explored corner of history. Their voices echo through the centuries, inviting us to pause and reflect on their struggles, their triumphs, and their tragic fates. If you've enjoyed this journey through the annals of the imperial harem, I encourage you to like, subscribe, and share this series with others who might find it enlightening. There are so many more stories waiting to be told, so many more secrets of history to uncover. But for now, let us bid a fond farewell to the concubines of ages past, and let their memories linger with us like the fading notes of an ancient melody. May they rest in the peace and serenity that so often eluded them in life. And thank you, dear viewer, for joining me on this journey through the pages of history. Until next time, this is your faithful guide to the forgotten corners of the human story, wishing you pleasant dreams and restful slumbers. Good night.